correctional officer in the room, I was very cautious in saying, how are you feeling you're being treated here? That's sort of a safe way of asking, is there anyone treating you well? Is everyone treating you okay? Are you feeling safe? Is there anything we need to talk about in further detail? And he denied there was any concerns. I asked about suicidal thoughts. I asked about homicidal thoughts. The whole time I'm doing this, of course, I'm watching what I'm seeing because a lot of our job is observing. And based on my observations, I know how deep to go into something. So as well, I was asking him, a lot of times when people are acting out of character, was there anything that he was thinking or feeling that was contributing to it? In particular, I will often preface questions about hallucinations by saying a lot of people in these circumstances may experience alterations in the way they think, in the way they experience things. Have you noticed any changes in what you're hearing, in what you're smelling, in what you're tasting, in what you're feeling? Because sometimes as well with withdrawal you can have some of that. And he had acknowledged in his notes to several people he wondered if he was, quote, detoxing. So I bring up all the senses and say, was there anything that you were experiencing that was off? And he denied.
Okay. And what was his general demeanor while you spoke with him?
I went in sort of knowing that he was a gentleman who was involved in the accident Friday, and hearing what happened Friday night and that they required additional staff to be present, and then they required that he be 4-point restraint, which was shackles on both hands and arms. I was a little bit nervous going in because I didn't know what I was going to encounter. Was he going to be angry? What was there? So I didn't know what I was going to see, so I was surprised that he was sitting watching the football game, and he was very quick to shake my hand when I said who I was. Even though his arms were shackled, he still had enough room, because I came to his right side, was still able to motion to me to shake my hand. And so very accepting of me coming in, and very aware of who he had already met, and remember Dr. Runyon, remember Dr. Martin from the night before, who was the resident.
Okay. And I think you stated in there somewhere that you felt like he was emotional.
Yes.
What did you get that impression from?
So he had his right eye was blackened, so bruised right eye, and occasionally there was tears coming from his left eye. Now it wasn't sobbing as a sense of if you hear someone they get congested and crying, but there was tears coming from his eye. And of course, as a psychiatrist, if I see something, I'm going to ask. So I said, I notice you're tearful right now. Do you want to talk about what that might be? And I think I said something along the lines of, there's been a lot that's been happening lately in here, and I see it often. You get put in a room with 4 walls, you have a lot of time to think. So I said to him, this is a lot of time to think in here. Is that contributing, or something along the lines of, may that be what's going on? And he didn't want to elaborate on what was causing him to be tearful.
And what were some of the signs or the symptoms that you were particularly paying attention to in observation rather than actual answers?
So, if you go to your primary doc, you have a physical exam done. And the physical exam can be short, can be long, depending on what the physician finds as they're going through your exam. So for psychiatrists, our physical exam is our mental status exam, which you'll hear about. And essentially it starts from the minute we enter the room. What's the connection like between yourself and the person you're talking to? How do they greet you? How focused are they? What's their body language? Are they too active, underactive? What's happening with their movements? How focused are they? Can they pay attention to the conversation? Can they follow the conversation? Do their answers jive with what you're asking about? Does their sentence structure make sense? Is a noun followed by a verb in the same tense, in the same context? Are they staying on task? Are they distracted? The TV was on, so I was curious to see some people, if they're, for example, manic, will not be able to sit and stare and talk to you. There will be the TV. There will be any distraction will make you distracted. So I was checking to see if that was happening. Also to see was there any additional signs to suggest what we talk about internal stimuli, anything that's going on inside your head that's distracting. Prime example, if you see someone with earbuds in and they're listening to a TED Talks and you're trying to have a conversation, you can tell they're not listening to you. There's a missing part to it. So if you're talking to someone who's actively having psychotic symptoms, hearing things, misinterpreting things, they will not be able to stay with you. Sometimes you'll see this. There'll be a look, there'll be something that'll, and of course I'll say, what just happened there? Why did you look away? So I was looking for that as well to see was there any active psychosis occurring. As well, if you're psychotic, your thought processing will be impaired. You may have hesitations in your choice of statements. You may not be able to stay in the flow of the sentence because something else is catching your attention and bringing you out of that focus.
Okay. So in your experience, you can opt in, or you have made that determination without somebody telling you that they are having these thoughts or hallucinations.
Right. So in my role on the secure unit, essentially the ICU of psychiatry, a lot of the patients, usually if you're having psychotic symptoms, be it from a primary thought disorder like schizophrenia or a mood disorder from bipolar or from depression, you will have pretty significant symptoms, especially for mood things. For you to have psychosis, your mood symptoms have to be quite prominent. So not only are you looking for the psychotic symptoms, you're looking for other displays depending on what has caused it. Most times when you're that ill, it is very hard to articulate what's happening. So frequently, patients will not be able to tell me they're hallucinating or experiencing changes in their thinking, but you will be able to observe it through observations. And as I said, most times I will say that to people, and people are pretty open. I mean, it's kind of hard if you suddenly look away for you not to say you didn't look away.
So when you were interacting with Mr. Bourgoin, was his thought processing intact?
Yes.
And was he focused on your conversation?
Yes.
And he was able to forget about the football game and focus on you?
And even the corrections officer, because I was concerned. Sometimes people will also guard what they're saying based on, they'll sort of give a look or something, and I didn't see that as well. He focused on me, was able to even talk about his progress through the treatment so far, and we even discussed when he was going to transfer to Fanny Allen. He said, I think it's going to be Monday.
Okay. And did you observe any of these perceptual disturbances that you just described?
I did not.
Did you ask Mr. Bourgoin if he was experiencing any of these perceptual disturbances?
I did.
Okay, so you didn't observe them. Well, what did he say to you?
He denied.
Okay, so you didn't observe any, and he didn't indicate that he was having any.
Correct.
And when you state that he affirmatively denied, can you tell me how you ask that question? Like, are you asking it very broadly, or do you very specifically ask, are you experiencing any, whatever?
So as I
What's your
said
question?
earlier, I usually explain what they are. Oftentimes people in your circumstances may have alterations in their sensations.
Okay.
And then I go through the 5
Yeah.
senses.
And ask them.
Yeah, have you
Okay.
noticed this, 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 or this?
Okay. And have you interacted with patients in your experience who have attempted to hide these symptoms?
Yes.
And in fact, may deny that they're having these symptoms?
Right.
And is it your opinion that your training and experience would allow you to determine whether they're being truthful with you?
Yes, I've like I said, I started working with most of my patients. 80% at least of the patients that I saw on a daily basis had some degree of psychosis. So this is the bread and butter of what I did every single day. So I feel very comfortable. And because of the state laws the way they are in Vermont, I've seen patients at the height of their psychosis, and because you have the right to refuse medication, even if you're involuntarily admitted, I have seen people at different phases of untreated psychosis for up to 30 days. Sometimes we've had to wait. So I can clearly tell you I feel very comfortable detecting if someone has psychosis, and if they're not telling me, you can still see it. Similar to if any of you sprained your ankle coming in here this morning, you could say, I'm fine, it feels well, and you could stand up still, but if you tried to walk across the courtroom, we'd all notice there's a little bit of a limp. So as physicians, we take symptoms, but then we also have to look at the findings to see if they support, and we're terrible for sometimes trying to hold back on symptoms, but you will see them if they're significant enough.
Okay. And in your role as an attending psychiatrist at UVM Medical Center, have you observed patients who are in a manic state?
Yes, frequently.
Okay. And what are some of the symptoms that you look for when someone's or to determine if someone's in a manic state?
So if someone's the best way I've described it to patients and their families is it's almost as though someone gave you this strongest stimulant you've ever had in your life. And it feels fantastic. You have energy to burn, and you just don't get tired. You don't feel tired. You are driven, and nothing slows you down, and you just keep going. Your speech is much faster than mine is right now, and sometimes it gets so fast that you can't even keep up with it. Your speech will go all over the place. You'll be very, very socially engaged. You'll want to just talk to any stranger you can see anywhere. You will be distracted by everything in the environment, anything that happens. It's very hard, like for example, in the emergency room, if someone comes in and they're manic, to actually keep them in the room because they will go to other people's rooms. It's this just sort of feeling exuberant and wanting to be part of everyone and a real inflated self-esteem. And if the mania becomes high enough, you will have psychotic symptoms. They're usually psychotic symptoms typically are congruent with the mood. So if someone is psychotic and they're manic, it is in keeping with the grandiosity. A common one is religion. I am the Messiah. I know I am the next coming of Christ. It's that kind of thing. So that's usually what then drives things, is this desire to invent new things, to give your money away to everyone you see. It's an altruistic kind of feel.
Okay. And in your interaction with Mr. Bourgoin, were you specifically looking for any signs of mania?
Yes, so I was looking for all the differentials that I mentioned earlier.
And in your time speaking with him, or your review of the medical records ahead of time, or your conversation with Dr. Martin, did you find any evidence that Mr. Bourgoin was in a manic state?
There was no evidence, and for me, the most pertinent thing was he had slept the entire night before. A manic person does not sleep, and they don't feel the need to sleep. And as an inpatient psychiatrist, the amount of medication it takes to try to have someone manic sleep even 2 hours is unbelievable, the amount. It's unheard of. And as they get better, they don't even need those amounts, but in that acute manic episode, it is unbelievable the amount of energy that people can experience.
And were you also looking for signs of paranoid delusions?
Yes.
And again, did you see in your review of the records, your conversation with Dr. Martin, and your own interaction with Mr. Bourgoin, did you see any evidence of paranoid delusions?
So there was no evidence of paranoid delusions and no evidence of disorder of his thinking. So paranoid delusions typically are with a primary psychotic disorder of the schizophrenia spectrum. So part of it is delusions, the other part would be disorganization of behavior or speech. There was no disorganization.
Okay. And finally, were you looking for signs of psychosis?
Yes.
And in your review of the records, your conversation with Dr. Martin, and your interaction, did you find any evidence that Mr. Bourgoin was psychotic?
So again, psychotic is sort of the symptom term that you can experience if you have severe mania, severe depression, schizophrenia. They're sort of the main diagnoses where you will see psychosis. Otherwise, you won't see psychosis. Primary thought disorder, primary mood disorder is where you'll see it. And there was, again, you'd look for perceptual disturbances, hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, disorganized behavior, and I did not see that.
And do you feel, are you confident in your opinion despite only meeting with him for, well, I'll say first, how long did you meet with him?
It was around 20 minutes.
And so, do you feel confident in your findings despite only meeting with him for 20 minutes?
Yes.
And can you tell the jury why?
So a lot of the background that you need, you determine from, that's the benefit of someone being in an inpatient setting. You have the benefit of multiple observers throughout multiple times during the day, observing someone, and as well, from a psychiatry point of view, also observing whether they're taking care of their basic needs, such as sleeping. Sleeping is an important part of our decision-making and how they interact with others. A hospital environment is so stimulating, so that if you're psychotic, it can really trigger you. If you're manic, it can really trigger you. So sometimes you'll actually see almost an enhancement of symptoms being in the hospital. And so we also have the benefit of the timeline. What has happened over these days? And so, yes, all of that information helps to start, and then based on the assessment, if there's pertinent findings, I would have dug into those deeper. But as I said, it's like your physical exam. If your doctor listens to your heart and your heart sounds fine, not going to dig any deeper because the initial part of the examination yielded no significant findings. So you go through all of the different areas that you expect to screen, and if they're coming up negative and your history and your physical supports that, then yes, that's as long as your interview will take.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Okay, Cross.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Doctor. So you met with Stephen Bourgoin on October 16th, 2016, correct?
Correct.
And that was a week after the accident, correct?
Yes.
And you just testified you met with him for 20 minutes, correct?
15 to 20 minutes, yes.
You met with him for 15 to 20 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. No further questions. Thank you. No
All
further
set.
questions.
Okay, you can step down. Thank you. Okay. It's a nice view.
Better when the sun's out.
Okay, so State can call the next witness.
Thank you, Judge. The state would call Dr. Paul Cotton.
Stand by the chair, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly affirm the evidence you shall give relative to the cause now under consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth under pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
Please be seated while we seat up to the microphone.
Thank you.
Speak into the mic.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cotton.
Good afternoon.
Can you just state your name and spell your last name, please?
Paul Cotton, C-O-T-T-O-N.
And can you tell us what your profession is?
I am a physician in the specialty of psychiatry.
Okay. And can you briefly describe your educational background?
Surely. I was an undergraduate at Columbia College and went to Tufts University School of Medicine. I did my residency in psychiatry at Tufts University School of Medicine, and then I began my work career.
Okay. So tell us about your work career. I know it's long, so a summary of what
Surely.
you've done.
I worked at Harvard Medical School at the Cambridge Hospital. I was hired to develop a community-based treatment service to help patients leave the Cambridge unit at Westboro State Hospital, and we had 23 staff that helped with the institutionalization and with the treatment of those seriously ill people. 2 years later, I was asked to become half-time in that job and take over as chief of psychiatric inpatient services at Cambridge Hospital. I was the chief of psychiatric inpatient services there for 3 years, and then was asked to become the psychiatric director of inpatient services for the Cambridge Hospital unit, the State Hospital unit, and the Somerville unit, where I worked until 1983 when I was hired to become the founding medical director of a newly built hospital, 125-bed psychiatric hospital south of Boston in Pembroke, where I stayed until 1995 as the medical director of this service. Where we treated, as they told me when I left, somewhere over 13,000 different people over the course of those dozen years. I then came to Vermont in 1995, where I began to do practice and was asked by the Department of Mental Health's medical director to help with forensic psychiatry, which was an area of subspecialty for me. And so I began to, in addition to doing practice, to do forensic evaluations for the Vermont Department of Mental Health. In addition to that, I was the medical director on a part-time basis for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont for their psychiatric services. In 1997, I was asked to become the senior supervising psychiatrist for the Vermont Department of Corrections, a task which I completed after moving to become what the department called the psychiatric director from 2000 to 2006. I left Blue Cross in 2000. And in 2007, I began to joined the University of Vermont, where I worked in the counseling and psychiatry service. Additionally, I had, at Howard Center, become the psychiatrist for developmental services, persons with intellectual disability, asked to do that on a part-time basis by their medical director. And since that time, I've done work and I've done, in a consistent way, work with the Department of Mental Health as a forensic examiner. I'm also a consultant for VTIPSA, the Vermont Treatment Program for Sexual Abusers. I am also do developmental disabilities, psychiatric consultation, and see patients in Essex County, New York.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 123. Do you recognize this?
That is my curriculum vitae.
Okay, and is that up to date?
It is updated as of March 2019.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
We move to admit State's 123.
Any objection? 123 is admitted.
And qualify Dr. Cotton as an expert in forensic psychiatry.
Any objection? No objection. To be qualified in the area of experts, forensic psychiatry.
Have you been qualified as an expert in forensic psychiatry before?
Yes, many times.
Okay, including in Vermont
Yes.
and including in this court?
Yes.
Okay. Is most of your current practice in Vermont?
Yes.
Okay. And does the role of a forensic psychiatrist include the examination of individuals to determine whether or not they were insane at the time of an alleged offense?
It does.
And have you previously been requested or retained to conduct these examinations?
I have since 1996.
Do you have any idea how many individuals you've examined for sanity?
At one count, it was somewhere in the order of 1,900 different people.
Okay, and so likely more than that?
That's about what it was. I was asked, the department was asked, I was asked to ask the department for some testimony I did, and that's the number they gave me.
Okay, great. In what capacity, you've sort of just mentioned it, in what capacity do you currently do those examinations?
As a contract, I'm contracted with the State of Vermont Department of Mental Health. I have a contract for forensic psychiatric examinations.
Okay, and so how much of your contract with the Department of Mental Health is to do these examinations?
That is the only task with that contract, yes.
Okay. So can you explain to the jury how that works, how you become involved in that process and what you do?
Surely. When a person is charged with an offense, the state, the defense, or the court, or all of them, can ask for what is called a forensic psychiatric examination, and the judge orders the examination. It can be for the issue of competency to stand trial, which is understanding how the court works. The second part of the examination is what is called sanity at the time of the alleged offense. And it's often for both, but sometimes it's just for one of those two.
And then what do you do with that?
What I do with that is I schedule the examination with the court or the facility, usually either a hospital or a correctional facility that is where the examinee is being housed. And I go to the facility or to the court and meet with the individual whom I tell that I am a psychiatrist who was asked by the court to meet with them. I tell them the examination is voluntary. I tell them that although I'm a doctor, I'm not meeting with them as a treating doctor. I explain to them the non-confidential nature of the examination. I explain to them that unlike in a doctor's office where you need to sign a release of information before the doctor can disclose any information about his or her examination of the patient to anybody else, this examination is not confidential in that way, in that I will be sending my report to the judge, to the state's attorney, and to the defense attorney. And therefore I make it clear that if I ask them, him or her, a question that they prefer not to answer, that they should not answer it, and we just move on to the next question. And then I conduct my examination, write my report, and send it to the judge, to the state's attorney, and to the defense attorney.
Okay. So when you are asked to do these examinations, and you in fact conduct them, and you write a report, you are paid to do that work by the Department of Mental Health?
That is correct,
Okay.
by the Department of Mental Health.
So the court doesn't pay you for that service, correct?
Not for these examinations, that is correct.
And the state's attorney's office does not pay you for those services, is that right?
That is correct.
And the defense attorney doesn't pay you for those services?
That is correct for Department of Mental Health ordered examinations.
Okay. So when you're examining someone for the determination of whether or not they were sane at the time of the alleged offense, what are the prongs or the questions that you need to answer or determine?
Well, the two broad questions that are asked in the judge's order that comes to me is usually regarding competency. First of all, did the person understand how the court works, the legal process? And the second question has to do with a determination of the individual's sanity or mental state at the time of the alleged offense.
And how do you determine, what are the prongs related to insanity?
The prongs I'm sorry.
Related to an insanity finding?
The prongs. The prongs are, does the person have a mental disease or defect is one issue. The second issue has to do with does the person, did the mental disease or defect interfere with the individual's capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of the alleged offense? Or did the mental disease or defect affect the person's capacity to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law because of mental disease?
Okay. And so as to the first prong, as to whether somebody has a mental disease or defect, how do you go about determining that in these examinations?
What I tell the person whom I'm examining is that I'm going to be asking you the questions that a psychiatrist asks a person when they first meet with that individual in order to gather history. And the history involves the usual first psychiatric visit, and I go through and explain to people that I will ask them questions about their social history, which includes family history. I will ask them questions about their medical history. I will ask them questions about their employment history. I will ask them questions about their legal history, which is an important piece. I also let them know that these examinations are not confidential, and so I always tell them that they have the opportunity to decline to answer any question I asked. That it's a voluntary examination.
Okay. And once you have asked the questions that you need to ask related to that first prong of mental disease or defect, do you then go on to determine or to ask questions regarding the second prong?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And how do you go about doing that, determining the second prong?
So what I do is I generally there's police reports that are present that come with the request for the examination, and so I will review with them the police reports. They sometimes have reviewed them already with their attorneys. Sometimes their attorneys are present in the examination room with me. Sometimes the attorneys have contacted me beforehand but are not present, and sometimes I have had no contact with the attorney before I do the examination, and I review those issues with them.
Okay. And do these examinations that you do occur close in time to the alleged offense?
That depends on the court and the order of the judge.
Okay. So it depends on when order goes to the Department of Mental Health?
Yes.
Okay. And you stated a little bit about how sometimes you're provided with either the affidavits or the informations. How are you provided those documents?
I would want to answer, before I say that, I would want to answer that, just to be complete, there are two types of examinations. One are called inpatient forensic examinations, and the others, the more common one, are outpatient forensic examinations with some persons who are acutely ill. The department will ask for what's called an inpatient psychiatric examination because there's a question about hospitalizing this particular individual, and there are, although the examination is the same, the department has different standards in terms of what their responsibilities are that don't have to do with my or my colleagues' examinations, but there is a different timeline that's placed on an inpatient examination.
Okay. And so who decides what information you are provided when you're doing a outpatient examination?
The court. The court sends information by state's attorney, the order of the judge, and the police reports.
Okay.
Police affidavits. Yeah.
Okay. And do you ever ask a defendant or an individual that you are examining for a medical release or for additional information that you weren't provided?
Yes. I mean, if a person tells me that they have been a patient at the University of Vermont Medical Center on Shepherdson 6, where Dr. Kennedy works, or Shepherdson 3, or at Brattleboro Retreat, or Rutland Regional Medical Center, or Central Vermont Hospital, or another psychiatric service, or they've been treated by the Howard Center, it's part of the standard of practice to request a release of information, which I do, all of us do, and send that release to the place where the individual had treatment so that you can include that information as a part of the report regarding the individual's psychiatric history.
Okay. And is it up to the defendant whether or not they actually sign that release?
That is correct.
Okay. And so are you often making a decision about competency or insanity, or do you sometimes have to make a decision without all of the information?
Yes. Yeah. And the other release of information, I should add, because it's common. Oftentimes, an individual will want the examiner to speak with a family member, parents, children, spouse, so forth.
And so that would require the
same release of information. Yeah.
Have you had cases where you've written your report and you've given an opinion, and then you are asked by either the court or the state or the defense to do follow-up work or review on a case?
Do you mean to testify?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Surely. Yeah.
And what is your methodology in terms of conducting examinations?
What I tell the people that I'm meeting with is that after I go over the non-confidential nature of the examination, I tell them that I'm going to be asking you the usual kinds of questions that I ask an individual whom I'm meeting with for an initial psychiatric evaluation, the usual kinds of questions relating to family history, social history, work history, medical history, legal history, substance use history, that I would ask anybody that I meet for the first time. And then I will also be reviewing with you the police reports and the legal paperwork and going over that in order to gather your thoughts about the questions the court's asking, and for me to answer the questions that the court is requesting me to answer.
Okay. And do you record your examinations?
The way I do my examinations is the following. The Department of Mental Health in Vermont does not support the video recording of examinations. Therefore, the group of us that do this work, we either do it by typing on a computer or taking notes by another means, and I choose to use a dictaphone. I don't record the session, but what I do is I talk into a dictaphone, and I tell the individual the reason I'm doing this is for two reasons. Number one, so I don't have to type while we're talking. And the second and more important is that they get to hear my notes, and I often tell them if I make a mistake. If a person's wearing a blue shirt, I say, if I say you're wearing a green shirt, please interrupt me and tell me it's blue. And so, because I try to make it clear that I would like accurate data, so I hit the dictaphone and it goes on and off as I do my examination. Then when I'm done, I listen to the notes, transcribe them, and then create the report.
Okay. And are defense counsels sometimes present during these examinations?
Oh, surely. Yes.
And if they are present and want to video or audio record the examinations, are they allowed to?
Surely.
And after you complete an examination, you said you listen to the dictaphone notes and then you write a report. Can you tell us a little bit about how you do that, what your process is for writing a report?
Well, what I do is I take the notes and I use them as the basis for the different sections in the report. The report, in broad strokes, has the kind of information that I just mentioned. First, the information about the offense, then often other legal information, what we call a competency assessment, and then so the current alleged offense, the competency assessment, and then in different order: social history, medical history, substance use history, legal history in the family, and other issues that may be of relevance in a particular instance.
Okay. So in your initial transcription from your dicta notes, is that everything that you said in your examination or after your examination? Does that include at least originally everything? It includes
originally everything. Sometimes what I will do, and what I did in this case, when there's a significant question, I will take my report and I will look at the possibilities for mental disease or not being a factor, whether the person was insane at the time of the offense in terms of the legal definition. And I will think about what the diagnosis would be if they were insane, and I would think about a diagnosis when they weren't insane based upon the data that was present. And I'll look at the two in terms of trying to weigh the data, the evidence that supports my final finding, and then I'll make a final finding.
So in your initial dictation, you would have any type of comments or edits of things that might support a finding one way or the other?
Both. Usually it's both, and then I look at the data and I look at the diagnosis and I say, does this support a finding of sanity or insanity, okay, or competency or not competency?
Okay, and so once you've looked at the potential diagnoses and you've come to a conclusion, is that when you write your final report?
That is correct.
Okay. And you stated once you've completed your report, you send it to all of the parties involved?
I do.
Okay. And again, once that report is written, assuming that are there times when you don't have an opinion? You don't have enough information to make an opinion? Whether if somebody doesn't cooperate, for example?
Well, yes, if somebody, it's a voluntary examination, and sometimes people refuse to talk, or they refuse to discuss the offense, or they refuse to give information that would be helpful or necessary, let's say necessary to forming an opinion. And
and you have an opinion, have you, and you give those reports to the parties, have you then been called to testify at either a competency hearing by one of the parties as to your finding?
Yes.
Okay. And is it typical that you're being called by the party that your opinion supports?
Not necessarily. I mean, it could be called by the opposite party. It could be called because of the complexity of the case, and the courts want, desire for the data, or there may be an opposing opinion. There can be many different reasons. It's a small minority of the reports that actually get asked to be reviewed in court proceedings.
Okay. And are there a lot of times where you get asked by a party to come to court, but then the case resolves, or for some other reason you don't actually testify?
Oh, I'm sure that happens. Yeah.
And have you ever found a defendant to be insane for a homicide charge?
Yes.
And are there 2 pending homicide cases in Vermont where you have found the defendant to have been insane at the time?
Yes.
And
there are others that I have also.
And have you, in those cases, to your knowledge, been listed as an expert for the defense for any testimony to that finding?
Yes, I think in both of them, yeah.
Okay. And you've been asked by those parties to potentially conduct additional review of records or hospital records?
Sometimes in one instance, I was asked to do, the person remained, and I was asked to do a follow-up to my initial finding in order to determine if the finding was still the same.
Okay. And in those cases, did you come to your opinion close in time? Did you do your examination close in time to the alleged offenses?
I would have to, sometimes and sometimes not. I mean, the way these things occur.
Okay. And so getting to this case that you are here for, is this the process that we've just talked about? Is that the process that you followed and the methodology that you followed in your examination of Stephen Bourgoin?
Yes, I mean, it was requested by the Department of Mental Health to examine Mr. Bourgoin following the alleged offense.
Okay. And did you, in fact, examine Mr. Bourgoin?
I did. I examined him, I think it was right at the beginning of December, when at that point he was at Southern State Correctional Facility.
Okay. Was that on December 1st of 2016?
Yes. Yes.
And prior to meeting with Mr. Bourgoin, did you have any documents related to the charges against him?
Yes, I get all of the court paperwork gets sent to me, and in this situation there was a large amount of police reports and other documents that were included.
Okay. And do you recall whether you had actually reviewed all of those documents before you met with Mr. Bourgoin?
I certainly list all the things that I review. I would not, if something was sent to me before the examination, I would always review it before seeing the individual.
Okay. And so you had reviewed the charges against Mr. Bourgoin?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. And how long did you meet with him on December 1st?
For 4 hours.
Okay. And again, did you record the examination in the way that you've previously described?
Yeah, I did notes on my dictaphone.
Okay. And was Mr. Kadams present for that?
He was.
Examination? And did Mr. Kadams record the examination?
I don't know.
Could he have
I
if
don't
he wanted
recall.
to?
He surely could have. I don't recall specifically that he did.
Okay. You certainly haven't been provided with a recording of the examination, have you?
By Mr. Kadams?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
I have my recording.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was Mr. Bourgoin's presentation and demeanor while you met with him?
Well, I can say in general, overall, it was a very cooperative examination. I tell the people with whom I meet that although I'm here at the request of the court, I explain to them that it's important for me to understand, in order to fulfill the request of the court, to understand them as a person and to get past history and to understand their growth and development in a variety of ways. And I begin by, asking questions about that. And Mr. Bourgoin was, most cooperative. So he began, and I begin by asking, I said, before we're going to talk about the police reports and the offense, I'm going to ask you questions about your past history and so forth. And so he told me about his past history and where he grew up in Newburyport. I may have said this or not, but it turns out that I'm from Massachusetts, and I spent many summers of my life a few miles away in Amesbury, Massachusetts, for a variety of reasons. So we talked about Salisbury and Newburyport in a way that both of us knew. So he told me about his development. He told me about his dad and his mom, his older brother, 7 years older than he. He was, I think he was born in Keene, New Hampshire. His dad was a teacher, an educational leader. He was maybe head of school in some ways. And he moved around, had different kinds of work. And so he was born in Keene. I think his older brother was born in Newburyport. And then he told me that his mom and dad separated, and he moved back to Newburyport with her. He moved at one point to Rutland, I think, with mom and dad before going back to Rutland later. But he moved to Rutland, and then there were some issues, and somehow mom and he returned back. What I'm looking for in asking these questions is start of school, how he's doing in terms of his own cognitive and emotional development, getting to understand him in that way. And so he was quite straightforward in terms of giving that data. He had a very great stressor as a very young person. His mother developed cancer as a single mom at that time, and she was very ill, and he was alone living with her, I believe, and there was other family of hers in the community, but she died from her cancer, and he had aunts and uncles there and so forth. So he was able to describe his capacity to get on with other people and to carry on in school. He played football, and he more in Rutland where he eventually went. But he was a sports person, and he did some things. Mom died. He lived, I think, with a sister of Mom or a brother of Mom's for a time, and then moved up to Rutland to live with father and his his second wife, or one of his wives. And he described being able to deal with adversity. It was because he He told me about Rutland and what it was like and what it's like to come from Newburyport to Rutland and its community and how he got along and what he did in school and how he played football and how he tried to master, dealing with the community and dealing with his academic work while he was trying to also deal with his stepmother and his dad. He had a plan for himself that he developed, which was that to enlist in the Army because he wanted to go to college. He did not see himself being able to afford it, given a variety of different family reasons. And so he described how he developed the idea, had information from others, and decided to enlist in the Army because they would, if you were an active service person, and then after discharge, you could get reimbursed for your education. And so he told me about that, and he was in basic training. And as a part of basic training, he had a physical examination that they routinely do, and they found that he had an eye disorder. I think it was called, I may have the name wrong, keratoconus, but what it is it's a disability that the military says you're not eligible, and it wasn't picked up on his initial physical exam. So it was a big disappointment for him because he was discharged, not on any basis of anything he did, but on the basis of the fact that if they knew it at the time, he wouldn't have been admitted. And so, he returned to, came back to Massachusetts and, described his work life and what he did. He did work to sort of move forward. He talked about development of relationships that he had, meeting both his eventual wife and also a woman that he met with before. He got a very, he worked and he got a very, I think Anila was in Burlington. He came to Burlington. He got a very good job at a place called Logic Supply, and he enjoyed the work very much. It was a technical service in which they did computer kinds of work. It was a good group. He met his good friend Alan Kospic there, and it was very positive for him. And he also met Anila there. They decided, I don't recall the specific reason, but they decided to move back towards Newburyport. I think her family was there. And unfortunately, after he did that, he and she had a disagreement. He was charged with assault, and it was difficult for him. He did a plea agreement, which he described as regretting that he did, because it left this on his work history, left it on his record when people checked, and he said that it was, what it did was it made work in this computer industry type of work that he did for Logic Supply. He said they Google you and you just can't get a job in the field, and he was, it was a field he was very interested in. So he, it was very tough. There was Anila brought a charge against him in Massachusetts for a domestic assault. They had a fight, and she reported it, I think, to the Newburyport police, and so he did a plea agreement for this. I may have said this, and that was on the record, and that's part of what made it difficult for him to get a job. following that, I think she moved back to Vermont, but he had another relationship that he had lived in, whether it was with Anila or the next woman. He lived in Hampton Beach. His dad had a condo there, and he lived and worked with this other person. They had a good relationship that went on for a period of time, and then it came to an end. So at that point, he moved back to Vermont and reconnected with Anila. They were together. They bought their condo in Williston. They decided to get married. They didn't actually get married. There were some logistical complications, though it was planned. But they were together, and Anila became pregnant with their child, about which he was very excited. And what he told me was, because this was a part of the development of some of the difficulties, what he told me was that in that, I guess, when tax time came that year, he discovered that she had not reported herself as being married, or there was something, or underreported her income. It was the cause of a major disagreement between the two of them. And it was in this period of time that, and the baby came, and he had worked at Heritage Toyota for a time, and he wanted to leave that job to use his severance to take care of their little girl. He was very connected with the baby, and so they had marital difficulties that he described going forward at that point in time. I think she was working at the Lund Center. So he was, he was actively thinking about how do you do all these things, and it was tough. And then he allegedly assaulted her. She reported to the police, and this was the beginning of very serious stress for him.
I'm going to just
Sure.
interrupt you for 1
Yeah.
second.
So, you know what, maybe before you ask your next question, this is actually a good time to take
For a
our
break? Okay.
break.
Yeah.
So we're going to break for 15 minutes so you can stretch, and we'll be back here resume with Dr. Cotton's testimony.
Thank you, Judge. Dr. Cotton, you just gave us a lot of information about Mr. Bourgoin's history that he presented to you on December 1st. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Of 2016. So we'll come back to that a little bit later, because did all of that information go into your ultimate finding? Is that important for you to make a finding?
Yes.
And were you able to ultimately diagnose Mr. Bourgoin with anything?
I diagnosed him with an adjustment disorder because of the disturbance of mood and behavior.
Okay. And can you we'll get into it a little bit more later, but can you just give the jury a brief synopsis of what adjustment disorder is?
An adjustment disorder is a condition of distress with disturbance of mood and behavior that arises from identifiable stressors. And I used that diagnosis, I thought, about the issues regarding mental disease. And I was I did not find data to support a diagnosis of mental disease. And so I used this disorder because of the fact that it can describe in my opinion, what he was experiencing and some of the stressors that that led to his actions.
Okay, thank you. And you spoke quite a bit about his sort of personal and family issues. Did he also give you a description of his medical history?
His physical medical history?
Yes.
Either
his physical or any psychiatric history?
Yes. I mean, he told me when we went over his general medical history, he told me that he had been a patient of Dr. Koutras at the University of Vermont Medical Center. She was his outpatient physician. And when he was going through the difficulties that he was experiencing at home and at work, they were both, she suggested to him that he consider the use of I believe, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, such as Prozac or fluoxetine, one of them. And they had it's noted that they had a discussion, and he elected not to do that. He expressed some concern about the effect of the medication, and he thought that he could make some of his own alterations, and I believe he described that he stopped he didn't use alcohol. He used a certain amount of marijuana oil in a day. He found that it was stabilizing. He made sure he didn't use other substances, but he felt that would be a better solution for him, and so that's what he proceeded with. And he did not take her. She was his ongoing primary care doctor, and he did not take her suggestion.
Okay. And did you again use that information informing your ultimate opinion?
Yes, in part.
Okay. And it sounds like Mr. Bourgoin in his social history explanation did talk to you about both of the domestic assault incidents that he was involved with Ms. Lawrence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And again, did you take those into account when you were making your ultimate opinion?
Yes, because he tied in the examination. He tied the pain that he had in trying to reconnect with his daughter, and going to see her, shortly before the alleged offense, and what it was like to be with her, to see her. Waving to him and so forth, and his not being able to have contact with her because of the court's rules. It was very, very difficult.
Okay. And Mr. Bourgoin, did he talk to you about the custody issues? Did he also talk to you about his financial stressors?
Yes, because he had worked he was working at Champlain Chocolates, and he described, his capacity, what he was able to do for work, and in the paperwork that some of his colleagues also described. He had a lot of lots of confidence in terms of thinking about how to ship things, and he would give suggestions and so forth. So he was on target for some of the work, but he felt increasingly discouraged about being there. The pay was not so good, and he would. It's one of the things he was discussing with his friend Alan Kosabek about what he would do and how he would do things.
Okay, and so again, you had reviewed the interviews or statements from his Lake Champlain Chocolate employee or coworkers?
Yes, I did.
And it sounds like you had also reviewed at least one statement from his best friend, Mr. Kosabek?
Yes, and also there was a statement from Mr. Kosabek's wife that he was also, in some ways, even more close to, that occurred just prior to the alleged offense.
Okay, that's Asima?
Yes.
Kosabek?
Yeah.
And again, did you use those documents in helping to form your ultimate opinion?
Yes.
Okay. And did you speak to Mr. Bourgoin about the week leading up to these crashes?
That week, yes, before, in which he had on the Friday at the end of that week, the one where he had the lunch at Five Guys, I think, with Alan. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did Mr. Bourgoin give you information about what he described he was feeling that week? Did he tell you what his state of mind was that week?
Yeah, he both told me what his state of mind was, and he described some of his actions. I mean, going over to them at night, there were some potential dialogue that he wanted to have with Alan's wife. In some ways, he described being even closer to her in terms of their personal connection. But he was in a state of great distress.
Okay. And did Mr. Bourgoin give you a fair amount of details about the things that he claims to have been experiencing that week? For example, let me ask you more specifically, did he tell you that he was communicating with his TV?
Well, he told me that he was having a variety of different sort of, for lack of a better term, I think the word he used was strange experiences, or bizarre experiences, when he was driving around, and places that he knew he was more anxious about, worried, suspicious, though he drove in these places frequently.
Okay. And did he tell you about going to the UVM Medical Center on Saturday morning?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what did he tell you was his reason for going there?
He was distressed, and he was just wanting to get some help.
Did he say that he wanted to be somewhere safe?
I don't recall specifically, but he did say that he wanted some assistance.
Okay. And it's your understanding he told you that he ultimately left UVM Medical Center?
Correct.
All right. And that did he tell you that he went home after that?
He did.
And that he went to sleep?
He said and then it was, in my examination of him, he described getting up and, getting in the car. Actually, I think it was his father-in-law's truck, Toyota. He described his Toyota Tacoma or something like that truck. And he, in driving, but he was, when he talked to me, he didn't have much in the way of memory of the events. It was obscure in his mind till the crash happened.
Okay. And did he tell you that he had been researching stuff on his computer?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall that he specifically told you he'd been searching on his tablet that the state had in its possession?
I don't recall that specifically.
And
He may have, I just don't.
okay. And again, to the best of your recollection, do you recall what he stated about the actual crashes?
He told me, I believe, in the examination that he did not. He remembered coming up the highway. He remembered the crash. He talked a little bit about it. He remembered the police car. But in our discussion, it was limited in terms of the details.
Okay. About some of those details, did he recall going down to the median and opening the door of the vehicle in the median?
I don't recall. I don't recall specifically.
If he had mentioned some
Yeah.
of those details, would they have been in your final report?
They would have been.
And was that-
I've read what was. I've read what was his reaction to opening the door. I don't recall specifically if he told me that.
When you say that, do you mean it because you've since reviewed other interviews with
Correct.
other examiners?
Well, no, I reviewed the police reports
Okay.
it was in the police reports from the police description of the accident.
Okay. So if I showed you your report as to the alleged offense, would that
Yes.
refresh your recollection?
Yes, it's.
Okay. So I'm just going to show you what's been marked as States 126. Is this your final report?
That is.
Okay, so if you can just review it to yourself, and then if that refreshes your recollection, we can answer it after, but don't read it from your report.
Yes. Yes, yeah, now I remember this. Yes,
Okay, so I'm just going to take that.
surely.
So what's your understanding of what Mr. Bourgoin told you about the crashes?
That he came to the car that was hit. He looked in. He had this experience of seeing people in it that looked like mannequins. He became upset. He ran to the car that had the lights, which was the police car. He got in it and he drove away south on the interstate.
Okay. And did he tell you that he got into the vehicle and he pressed all the red lights in the middle of the console and they all clicked off?
He may have. I'd have to look again.
And so he gave you a fair amount of details. Is that
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he was very straightforward in the dialogue.
Okay. And again, did you consider Mr. Bourgoin's statements around his mental state and ultimately forming your opinion?
Yes.
Okay. And in your report, you state that Mr. Bourgoin's thoughts were organized and that he had logical connections between ideas. Can you just explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, although what I mean by it is he was able to talk to me about the series of events that occurred. And what he said was that when he went to the car, using this as an example, when he went to the car and he looked in the car, it was a frightening, bizarre sight for him. And he was overwhelmed. And he ran away and saw the police car and got into it and drove down the interstate. And was distressed and turned around and came back and smashed into his father-in-law's truck.
Okay. You also state in your report that those stressors and symptoms were eventually so severe that it produced distortions of his thoughts, and that his reports are consistent with delusional thoughts.
Yes.
Can you explain, is it your opinion that Mr. Bourgoin was delusional? And if not, what can you explain the difference?
His reports are consistent with delusional thoughts. They're irrational. But the reason I said that in the way that I did was that he, in my opinion, like happens when there's a catastrophic event that occurs, that people in the immediate aftermath of the catastrophic event can have a thought that is irrational. It's unrealistic. That it's not that he hit this car and the people were injured because of the accident, but it was, they were mannequins or some other substitution for real people.
So is somebody having delusional thoughts different from somebody that has a delusional disorder?
It's different in the following sense, that sometimes when there's a catastrophe, people, their first thought is, it can't be true. It can't be true, and therefore they aren't real people, they're mannequins. Is an example of a thought that a person could have, and then the piece of his action in terms of running from the scene and jumping into the car is what also can happen, which is that there's a piece of your experience that lets a person understand that something terrible has happened and that they've been a part of it. And when you talk to people who've been involved in situations like this is sometimes the sequence that happens. They can't acknowledge the detailed reality of what actually occurred, but you see their behavior following the piece of it that they know there's a disaster that they were a part of.
Okay. And so you have this 4-hour examination with Mr. Bourgoin. It sounds like you received a fair amount of information from him. Is that true?
Correct, I
Okay.
believe so.
Okay. And in that examination, he talks to you about these delusional thoughts and states to you that that's what was going through his mind the week of the crash. Is that in a summary form?
Yes, and talked about his wish to get back with Anilla and so forth. I mean, there was with his child, etc.
Okay.
There's a number of things he talked about in the exam.
So you finish your examination with him, and you ultimately write a report in this case. Is that right?
Correct.
And so in this particular case, can you tell us how you went about taking your dictation notes and doing the kind of weighing
Sure.
the options and then
Yeah.
writing your final report?
You know, I try to weigh, is this mental disease or defect or not? And people can have acute psychotic, irrational experiences, and clearly, you know, his seeing the mannequins in the car is irrational. They were people, and the question in my mind came: is that of the moment when he came to grips with seeing what had happened, or was that a part of a mental disease that was ongoing at the time? And my conclusion was, although I raised the question in my own mind, my conclusion was, given what was described during the day and given what the pattern of behaviors were, it was my opinion that it was more the acute single thought rather than a mental disease, and that's why I came down on the side of the diagnosis that I did.
Okay, so again, just to explain this dictation process and your processing to write a report, you dictated at some point that there was, given the defendant's statements, that there could be an acute psychotic disorder at play.
Correct.
Okay, and you also you also determined or talked about in your dictation whether or not there wasn't.
Correct.
Is that fair? Okay. So if the defense has represented to the jury that you wrote 2 reports, is that correct?
No.
Okay. And is it more correct that the original dictation just had all of this other information in it?
Well, I'm doing this on a computer, and what I do is I do a report and I put certain things in it, and then I do the same report with a lot of the same data, and I put the other things in it, and I look at the 2 things, and I try to think through which is more accurate, which is my opinion, not more accurate, but which is my opinion.
And which one has more data or evidence
Yes.
to support it?
Yeah, and I came down to the fact that since the prodrome, the time before and the time after, did not support psychosis as an ongoing, as a disorder. That's why I made the diagnosis that I did.
Okay. So in your initial dictation, you stated that Mr. Bourgoin described a series of emotionally dysregulated acts and concerns. Is that based on his statements that you received in the examination?
Yes, I mean, and Alan, in what we were describing during the, what I was describing before the event.
Okay.
Yeah.
And again, you in your initial transcription, you said that with respect to mental disease or defect, Stephen Bourgoin may have had an acute psychotic disorder at the time of the alleged offense. That condition appears to have included active symptoms at the time and would be considered a mental disease.
That is correct.
Okay, and so can you just explain to the jury again why that's in your initial dictation but not your ultimate finding?
Because I do, the way I do it is that I have these templates, and I do them up with my you know, what I consider the possibilities, and I then think about the data that supports one or the other, and you know, in this instance, especially given what the prodrome was and what happened the night before and the various things that he was able to think about and do and so forth, it did not, in my opinion, it did not meet the standard for a psychosis.
Okay.
That also I also had data at that point from UVM Medical Center, so
Okay.
we at both.
And so you have these, like you just said, you have these ideas of what it could be, and then you look at additional data and evidence and documents, and then determine whether there's any evidence beyond Mr. Bourgoin's statement to corroborate that or negate that.
Yes, both.
Okay.
Yep.
And again, in your opinion, you do not have the opinion that Mr. Bourgoin had an acute psychotic disorder. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, my opinion was he was not insane at the time of the alleged
Okay.
offense.
And so you do ultimately opine that Mr. Bourgoin has adjustment disorder, and that you talked about that being due to identifiable stressors. So
Correct.
can you just tell the jury what, in your mind, in your opinion, those identifiable stressors were at the time?
Sure. I mean, he loved his little girl, and he regretted all of the difficulties that had gone on between him and his wife. He was struggling to carry forward, and he was increasingly unable to do so. He had this. There was some data that came forward at Lake Champlain Chocolates. I mean, he was in the week before this all happened. He's talking with one of the people that gave a deposition. He's talking about how to ship material to the West Coast in the way that's both most efficient and cost effective and so forth, and how you can package it and how many days it takes and so forth. So he's struggling to do the right thing and is involved with other people who report during this period of time that this is the way things are going. At the same time, he's torn apart by his inability to reattach to his family and to his daughter. So it's a terrible. That's what he was experiencing in my mind, and going to Alan in the middle of the night, and talking with Alan's wife. I mean, these were he was articulating these issues.
Okay. And it's your opinion that those were stressors in his life at the time?
Well, sort of reestablishing himself on a how do I stabilize myself, to use common language, it was what he was struggling with.
Okay.
And he kept trying to do it, whether he was at work or another place with his friends.
Okay. And is adjustment disorder a mental disease?
No, because the definitions for mental disease, there's time spans in which you want to see the presence of symptoms of mental disease before you can make the diagnosis. So whether you're dealing with disorders of mood or disorders of thought, if you look at the diagnostic, you want a certain period of time in which these symptoms are continually present in order to make the diagnosis.
Okay. And how do you determine what a mental disease is, whether something is a mental disease as it relates to an insanity defense?
Well, I use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And so if you look at the definitions for disorders of mood or disorders of thought, there are timelines in which you need to have symptoms need to be present for a certain period of time in a consistent way in order to make the diagnosis, and it's different for the different pieces. But there's a matter of time. It can't be for an hour.
Okay. And so as to the first prong that you were tasked with deciding back in 2016, were you able to opine with a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether or not Mr. Bourgoin was sane at the time of the offense?
Yes, and my opinion was, the way I put it, he would not be considered insane.
Okay. And again, what is your opinion as to whether Mr. Bourgoin had a mental disease at the time?
It was my opinion that he did not meet the definition for mental disease of either thought or mood at the time.
Okay, so we've talked about, and the jury has heard from others about these two prongs and the insanity
Yes.
finding. It's your opinion that he doesn't meet the first prong.
Correct.
And at the time you're doing the evaluation, without knowing what your ultimate finding would be, do you still go on and talk to the defendant about aspects that might impact your finding on the second prong?
In other words, to conform conduct to the requirements of the law?
Yeah.
In my opinion, they meld together. The example that's sometimes used is you have to look at the offense, and you have to look at the mental disease, and you have to see how the two fit together, so that you can have a mental disease with a disorder of thinking, that there's data to support that you committed an offense that is linked to that disorder of thinking. The teaching one that's used is, the next door neighbor is dangerous to me and they board up their house and so forth. You can also have a mental disease in which you can commit an offense in which it's not connected. You steal the neighbor's car and you have mental disease. So I mean, I'm using those as simple examples, and just in other words, to make the point that you need to be able to think about how these things link together. And in my opinion, that's why I came to the opinion that I did.
And so as to the second prong, do you have an opinion about, and even back in 2016, do you have an opinion about whether or not Mr. Bourgoin could conform his conduct to the requirements of law?
I do.
What's that opinion?
My opinion is he could have.
Okay. And do you have an opinion about whether he could appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct?
Yes.
And what's your opinion on that?
That he appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Okay. And again, I know you just explained this a little bit in terms of the two melding, but how did you come to an opinion that he was able to conform his conduct and just didn't? Because
although he was overwhelmed, which you can be in a variety of ways, he did not have mental disease that was the fact. Mental disease, a disorder of mood or thought, was not the issue that was definable and overwhelming to him.
Okay. And do you believe that there's evidence in his behavior that night that would substantiate that? The actions that he took?
Yes, the night before. I mean, he was talking with friends. He was expressing wish to have more time with his neighbors, especially the wife with whom he was connected. He was aware of the fact that he was a person in great distress. He talked about it over dinner. He was thinking about it in terms of his work and what he was going to do because he decided to leave Lake Champlain Chocolates. He was despairing in a serious way.
And what about his actions after the crash? Did those play a part in your opinion that he could appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct?
He knew there was something that was wrong, and he ran away from the scene. And when he came back, he did not talk with me about this, but when he came back, he hit the car that he drove to the scene. So I don't know, but it would seem to me that he was just, as one would be, just so overwhelmed by the whole thing that he just lost it in terms of his behaviors. But that does not equal being insane at the time.
And so, in kind of conclusion, in your 2016 examination and writing your report, what was your ultimate sent to the parties?
My ultimate conclusion was he would not be considered insane at the time of the alleged offense.
Okay, and that's because you didn't feel there was any evidence to substantiate the presence of a mental disease?
Disease or defect.
Okay. And did you in fact wrote a report and sent it to the parties? Was that the sort of end of your involvement in this case at the time?
Yes.
Okay, and typically when you write a report, unless one of the parties contacts you, is that you're finished with your...
That's
part?
correct.
Okay. And so at some point, are you asked to complete more work on this case?
Well, was I asked?
Were you asked to complete more work?
Yes, because it was coming to litigation.
Okay, and so do you recall when that was?
I don't. It was quite some time. I mean, I saw him in right at the beginning of December 2016. So, it was years later.
Yeah, was it more recently?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sometime in 2018, I heard about this.
And who asked you to become involved in the case again? Was it me?
Probably. I was going to say.
All right. And so when you were contacted, what was your understanding of what was being asked of you?
You mean more recently?
Yeah, this
Well,
year.
Not unusual in a usual manner. Other examiners saw him, had different opinions, and therefore there was going to be a contested hearing.
And so did the state ask you to review all of the additional information that had been received since you
Oh,
met
yes,
him?
yeah.
And did they ask you to determine whether or not it changed your 2016 findings?
They did.
Okay. And did the state ask you to do that review and then write an additional report?
I didn't write an additional report.
Okay. And were you instead deposed by the defense counsel once you finished your review?
I was.
Okay. And at this time that the state reached out to you to review further documents, did you have a present recollection of your interaction with Mr. Bourgoin?
Yes.
Okay. So that interaction had stuck out to you?
Yes. This tragic situation remains in my mind.
And so did the state in fact retain you to review all the additional information?
Yes.
Okay. And did you receive a fairly large amount of additional information?
I did.
Okay. And the jury has already heard, I think, twice about the voluminous amounts of discovery, so I won't go through all of it with you. But I will show you what has been marked as State's Exhibit 124. Do you recognize this?
Yes.
And what is that?
That's a listing of all of the additional documents from this year, from item 13 to item 44.
Okay, and are items 1 through 12, what are those?
Those are my 2016 reviews.
Okay,
When
all
I
the
did.
things you reviewed for the last one?
Yes.
Okay. The state would submit 124.
Any objection to 124 coming?
No objection to its admission. Your Honor, I have some questions, but I can do it on cross.
Okay, so 124 is admitted without objection.
And so when you got involved this year with this case, was part of your review an interview that Mr. Bourgoin had done with the defense investigator, Jamie Lee Kiley?
I think that was in the papers, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was it clear to you from that transcript that Ms. Kiley had met with Mr. Bourgoin prior to that interview?
Prior to my interview?
Prior to the interview that you were reading the transcript for?
I read material from the investigator that occurred before I met with Mr. Bourgoin.
Yes.
I think my memory is that the investigator met with Mr. Bourgoin either end of October, beginning of November, and I saw him beginning of December.
Okay. And could you determine in that transcript that Mr. Bourgoin had also met with a Dr. Linder before he met with you?
But yes, Dr. Linder, Dr. Robert Linder's name is mentioned.
Okay. And did you ask for any statements that the defendant had made to Dr. Linder?
Did I ask for that?
Did you ask the state to provide that?
I did. I believe I did.
And was that provided to you?
No.
Okay.
And I also asked for and got all of the Department of Corrections medical records.
Right, and you did get those?
Yes,
That's
those.
correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so the statements that, any statements that Mr. Bourgoin made to Dr. Linder were not disclosed to you by the defense, is that correct? You do not have those?
Correct.
Okay. And is it, after reviewing all of the additional evidence that the state gave you and documents that the state gave you, did your opinion on Mr. Bourgoin's diagnosis change?
No.
It's still your opinion that he has adjustment disorder?
Yes.
Okay. And have you since reviewed Mr. Bourgoin's previous medical history that includes multiple diagnoses of adjustment disorder? At UVM Behavioral Therapy, UVM Medical Center?
Oh, when he took yes, well, that had been, I think that had been present because what he did was he needed to take a course for the issues that occurred in Newburyport. When he wanted to come back to Burlington and wanted to resume the relationship with his family, that was one of the conditions. I believe that whether it was the Massachusetts court required, but he went to some, educational and therapeutic educational experience.
And is it your understanding that they also diagnosed him with adjustment disorder?
Yes, no, I read those, yeah.
And did you review the examinations that Dr. Ismarin and Dr. Kapoor completed with Mr. Bourgoin?
I did.
And did you feel that you needed to do any further examinations of Mr. Bourgoin?
No.
And why not?
I felt confident in my opinion, and it's not uncommon that people have different opinions, but based upon the data that I had at the time that I had it, and the time which was proximate to the offenses, these were much later. So I didn't feel I needed anything additional.
Okay. And so you've seen in those interviews, those examinations, that Mr. Bourgoin has continued to describe the same sort of ideas or thoughts about his mental state during that week. Is that correct?
In
the further examinations with Dr. Kapoor and Dr. Ismarin, that he stated a lot of those same things about communicating with his TV and his paranoid.
Yes, I don't recall specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised that he would be the same that he would describe.
Okay. And has your opinion about those thoughts and descriptions changed?
No.
Okay. And you reviewed Dr. Baranowski's report regarding malingering?
Yes.
Okay. And her finding that Mr. Bourgoin was not malingering when she did the tests in 2018, is that your understanding?
Yes.
And again, does that change your opinion?
No.
Okay. And why not?
Because of the examinations that were done by Jamie Lee Kiley and myself and the people at UVM were done at the time of the approximately very close to the time. And you know, when what gets said 2 years later, I don't, even if it's contradictory to what I thought, I still have my own opinion based upon my analysis of the information at the time. I didn't see any reason to change it based upon these later reports.
And this finding by Dr. Barnowski that was done nearly 2 years later?
Correct.
Okay. And you are aware that Dr. Osmarin diagnosed Mr. Bourgoin with bipolar disorder?
I am.
And is that a mental disease?
It is.
And in your opinion, is there sufficient evidence as it relates to Mr. Bourgoin to have made that diagnosis?
No.
And is there evidence that in fact contradicts that finding? Or negates?
I believe there is, in terms of you know, his various parts of his work and other history. I don't see the support. I didn't see the support for it in my examination and my review of his history in some detail up to that time.
Are you aware that in your review of Dr. Kapoor's deposition that she also doesn't believe there's sufficient support for that diagnosis?
Yes, I remember reading that. She had her own thoughts about his illness.
Is there, in your opinion, sufficient evidence to conclude that Mr. Bourgoin was manic during the week before the crash?
No.
And why is that?
Well, just I'd have to look at the dates, but just in general, I mean, he's working at Lake Champlain Chocolates. He's going to talk to Alan Kosovic. He's talking with Alan Kosovic's wife. Where are the signs and symptoms of mania at Lake Champlain Chocolates, where he was employed? Where are the signs and symptoms of mania at Five Guys and in these discussions with these people?
And were you in the courtroom just today when Dr. Kennedy and Dr. Onion and Dr. Knackle testified?
Yes.
And did you hear their descriptions of an individual in a manic state?
No. I did not hear that he was, in their opinion, in a manic state.
No, I'm sorry. Did you hear their description of what somebody is
Oh,
like
yes, in a
when they're
manic state. Yes, I am very familiar with what somebody is like in a manic state.
And do you agree with their descriptions of it as well?
Yes, I agree with their descriptions of what people are like in a manic state.
And you reviewed the records from Mr. Bourgoin's visit to the UVM Medical Center the morning of the crash, correct?
Yes.
And did you find any evidence in those that he was in a manic state?
No, there was no evidence that he was in a manic state, and there was no evidence later in the day when he came in, when he was examined by Dr. Sandra Steingart and the person whose name goes out of my head right in the moment from the Howard Center. He didn't say much to them, but his behavior was not. He didn't show behaviors that were irrational.
Okay. And you're aware that Dr. Kapoor diagnosed Mr. Bourgoin with borderline personality disorder? Is that
Yes.
correct? And in your opinion, is borderline personality disorder a mental disease as it relates to the insanity defense?
It can be. It usually, it's a very common disorder. It's very common. And so one would need to see pieces that met the standard for insanity as a part of the presentation of persons with borderline personality disorder can have other illnesses also. So it sometimes can mesh together. But in and of itself, long-standing maladaptive traits are seen in borderline personality disorder from late adolescence, which is a part of the description and so forth, is not considered a mental disease.
Okay. And again, in your opinion, why are personality disorders not considered a valid diagnosis for the purposes of the insanity defense?
Because it doesn't meet the prong of a disorder of thinking or mood so severe that it would impair the individual's capacity to either understand the wrongfulness of their act or conform their conduct to the requirements of the law.
Okay. And kind of along that same line, you said that it's a pretty common diagnosis. You have worked in the Department of Corrections in the past, correct?
I have.
And do you have an opinion about whether or not it's common for individuals who commit crimes to have a type of personality disorder?
Yes, it is common.
It is common, okay.
Yeah.
And is it as common for those individuals to qualify for an insanity defense based on that diagnosis?
Not usually. I mean, sometimes you can have more than one problem, but in and of itself, long-standing maladaptive traits are not considered mental disease.
Okay. And just as a sort of in conclusion, as to prong one, after the review of all of the additional information, do you have an opinion about whether or not Mr. Bourgoin suffered from a mental disease at the time of the crashes that he's here for?
Yes.
What is your opinion?
That he was not suffering from mental disease at the time of the crashes.
Okay, and so therefore, do you have an opinion about whether or not he lacked the adequate capacity to either appreciate the criminality of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of law?
I believe he did not lack the capacity to either appreciate the criminality or conform his conduct.
Okay, so in conclusion, do you have an opinion about whether or not Mr. Bourgoin was insane on April 8th of 2016 when he drove the wrong way on the interstate, crashed into a vehicle, killed the 5 occupants, stole a police cruiser, drove away, came back into the scene going over 100 miles per hour and crashed again? Do you have an opinion about whether he was insane at the time of those offenses?
I do.
And what is your opinion?
He was not insane at the time of those offenses, is my opinion.
Thank you. Lily?
Can I see the attorneys?
Please be seated.
We were just going through the logistics. We thought that we might be completely done with the evidence at the time we let you go today, but it's very clear to me that we're not going to be done with Dr. Cotton's testimony. Certainly, we would have cross-examination and possible redirect, and we can't go to 5 o'clock or 5:30. So what we're going to do is we're going to let you folks go home now, but let me talk a little bit about Monday. You are absolutely going to get this case, barring some major unforeseen set of circumstances, Monday. When you come in on Monday, I just really want to encourage all of you to bring stuff that will occupy you for an indefinite period of time. Obviously, the 12 that are chosen to do jury deliberations are going to be super focused on jury deliberations, but the 4 alternates that are not selected until the end of the case, and it's done randomly, as I explained in the orientation process, we still are going to keep around, and for lots of reasons that I think we discussed as well. So reading material, hobbies, anything that you want to bring with you, just bring with you, because I don't know who the alternates are going to be until Monday. So everyone should be ready to come and stay on Monday. Obviously, we are at the almost the very end of the case at this point. So, I'm going to continue to ask you to avoid all news accounts whatsoever. Any temptation to research anything on the internet, any conversations with anybody in connection with this case. We're almost there, and you've been great. And so I'm going to ask you to continue to abide by all of those instructions. Have a great weekend. For those of you who may be feeling under the weather, get plenty of rest. So we'll have you all back here on Monday. And I think what I want to do is have you back here and ready to go, let's say at 9:15. I said 9:30, but let's say 9:15. I am going to meet with the attorneys starting at 8:30 sharp, and we're going to go through the final version, hopefully, of the jury instructions, which we have to do before we get the case to you at this point. So I'd rather have the attorneys come in early so that we can work on that, so we limit the amount of downtime that you folks actually have. So with that, have an incredibly wonderful weekend, and we'll see you back here Monday morning ready to go at 9:15. Okay? Thank you. Okay, so 8:30 Monday morning.
No. Yeah, no.